Carl? Okay, awesome. Thank you. Is there a way to get the stage lights up a little bit? Or are they up? Okay, good. Fair enough. All right. There we go. That's a little better. Okay, so we actually asked for questions earlier and didn't get a whole lot back. So I've got a bunch of questions for myself.
I think I answered all the potential
questions. You did. It was
questions.
very thorough, so we're all good. Welcome to those joining us on the line. I know that there's a lot of folks on the line. So if you have questions, go ahead and submit them in the YouTube comment section or on our Facebook page. And we're monitoring both of those, and we'll get those to Tony as well. Or if you have a question in the audience, we have a microphone somewhere. Sonia's getting a microphone. And or you can just yell it. I'll repeat it for those watching online. And you can ask him about anything about hunting. I got a couple hunting questions.
Really?
I do. So you guys know I'm not a hunter, but I really want to learn. And I can explain why later. But part of it is because of the things that he talks about in regards. Well, we'll just jump in.
Yeah, let's hear it. What's your question?
So Tony, I for a long time was against hunting for myself. I was never one who was like nobody should hunt, but I was like I don't want to do it because when I was a little boy, I shot a bird out of a tree with a BB gun, real cavalier, and I went over and I was stunned that I hit the bird, and I went over to the bird, and the bird was like like one of those. I hadn't killed it, and I was like, oh gosh, and I knew I had to put it out of its misery. So I shot the bird and killed it. But it was, it was like there was no purpose behind me killing the bird. I had no reverence for life being taken, or even I didn't eat the thing. And I wasn't traumatized. Like I don't ever want to kill another animal ever again. But now, and we've chatted a little bit, and I've talked with many of you, and even my my good friends in here who are hunters. But there's something about this idea of like if I'm gonna eat meat, which I do eat meat.
Yep.
And I try to buy like the most ethically, sort of raised meat. That's why I love Chipotle, because they do like free-range pork and they do, they try to like ethically raise their animals. Went to go visit one of their farms in Iowa, Nyman Ranch Farms, where they get their pork from and so on. Anyway, and so I'm realizing that there's something actually deeply ethical about if I'm going to eat meat than harvesting my own meat.
Yep.
And you've talked about that a little bit. So I'd love to know maybe how your journey with hunting began, and if you sprinkle in some of that stuff, maybe like sort of why is it perhaps more ethical if you're going to eat meat to go ahead and harvest your own. But how did your journey with hunting start for you?
It started when growing up, like when I was in college, I think my uncle took my brothers and me to the Minnesota Horse and Hunt Club a couple times. But going to a hunting preserve is not hunting.
Yeah.
It's shooting because they put the birds out and those aren't wild birds and whatever. So my actual introduction to hunting happened when I was a youth pastor, and one of the members of the youth committee, like the youth board of the adults,
Yep.
He was a big hunter, pheasant hunter in South Dakota, and he owned a place up on Lake of the Woods in Ontario, Canada, and he invited me to go duck hunting with him. It was an incredible experience. I went with him twice up there. And he mentored me into hunting.
Yeah.
I think at first I was doing it for the adventure of it. I wasn't doing it for the meat harvesting kind of aspect of it. But I just loved being out in the wilderness. I loved watching the dogs work. I was a terrible shot. I think one of the reasons he liked to bring me up there was he could like shoot a double limit because I would miss so many birds,
Yeah.
So the ethical meat part of it, I think, was a minor footnote.
Okay.
For me, it was started with the adventure of it.
Yeah.
The ethical meat part of it has really grown for me.
Yeah.
Like, we have a freezer in the basement that you can't open it without like frozen meat falling on you. And he lifts weights like at least 2 hours a day. He's
perfect.
Yeah.
Wrestler?
He's a former wrestler now after his fourth concussion. He is no longer a wrestler.
Yeah.
So now he spends even more time in the weight room, and we get these like UPS delivers every day. I'm like, another box of protein powder? Seriously? Pre-workout? I mean, he's the whole deal.
Yeah.
But the kid eats like 2 pounds of meat per day.
Yeah.
He's constantly, there's always some venison thawing. I shot 2 deer this year, and he shot 1. I shot innumerable pheasants and a bunch of ducks and geese. So we eat a ton of meat.
Yeah.
We do have to buy some meat just because of the amount of meat that he eats. He's our last remaining kid at home. But Courtney and I, my wife and I, we've already made this commitment to one another that once Aiden is out of the house in a couple years, we plan to only eat meat that I've harvested.
Yeah.
And not to ever buy meat.
Yeah.
Which is a goal of ours. So that's a big part of it for me. I really do. I mean, I have anti-hunters, sometimes troll me or whatever, and my response is always the same. And that's like, do you eat meat? Yeah. Well, then give me a break. Like, somebody killed that animal, and I'm just killing the animals I eat as opposed to the way you do it.
And there's a disconnect, I think, for some people. Like I remember my daughter when she was little, when she was eating chicken, right? She all of a sudden put it together that, that's an animal that somebody killed. And because we live in this world now where we can go to the supermarket and we think that chicken comes from the supermarket, but it doesn't. So in some ways, you're really grounding yourself back into the actual source of...
Yeah, there's a guy named Stephen Webb who died a couple years ago. He was a theologian and a vegan and an animal rights activist.
Yeah. Stephen Webb?
Stephen Webb. But he wrote an essay in which he argued that vegetarians, which make up about 5% of the population, it's steady. Actually, it's not grown.
Yeah.
It's been pretty steady, 5% for about 50 years of the population is vegetarian, and about 4% of the population hunts. Oh. He says that 9% of the population has more in common than the other 91%, because at least that 9%, everyone understands. Whether you're a vegetarian or a hunter, you are attuned to the fact that death is a part of being a carnivore.
Yeah.
And the other 91% like to have that hidden away. Now, that brings me to one other thing that has become increasingly important to me, and that is being in touch with death. Now, you're a pastor, so you actually are with people sometimes when they die. Hospital chaplains, if you're doctors and nurses in the healthcare field. Like, there are some people in our society who are in touch with death, but most of us are not.
Yeah.
For the most of us, death is completely hidden away. Yep. And that's not how human beings are supposed to be. That's out of step with 100,000-year history of hominids, where humans had always been in touch and seen other people die.
Yeah.
And we don't. And this next weekend, a week from now, will be the 3rd anniversary of my father's death. I was in the room with him when he died, and I'll always remember that the paramedics came to my parents' house. My mom called me. I live a block away, and she said, "You better get over here. Your dad fell out of bed, and he's really struggling." And I was there when the paramedics arrived, and one of the paramedics had ashes on his forehead.
Wow.
It was Ash Wednesday.
Yeah, wow. Yeah.
And he had gone to Mass that morning.
Yeah.
Before he started his shift. And then my dad died 2 days later, 2 days after Ash Wednesday in the hospital. Actually, it was on Valentine's. That year, Ash Wednesday was Valentine's Day, so it was the 16th that he died. And I also, this year I shot a deer from at the edge of my range with my rifle from a tree stand, and the deer did not die. I hit it in the front shoulder, and it limped a little bit, and then I walked up to it, and this will make some people watching and listening uncomfortable, but that deer was, it was a terrible sight. Yeah. That deer was panicked.
Yeah.
I'm looking at a fellow mammal that I've inflicted an injury upon that is a mortal wound.
Yeah.
But the look of fear in that deer's eyes was similar to the look of fear in my father's eyes in the hospital on his deathbed. So I think I personally think it's a huge deficit in the modern Western world, how out of touch we are with death.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I was with a family, and the matriarch of the family was dying, and they had called me out to come and commend her really early on. And sometimes it usually happens later. They can kind of tell when they're going to, they're really close. But she was on hospice care in the house, and her grandkids were running around the entire, and it was probably a couple of weeks. I'm talking about Nancy, and that she was actively dying.
Yeah.
And my first reaction was like, this is so strange. These kids are in the house, and I bet they think it's weird, And then I realized, no, this is actually quite beautiful, because they were there to be with her and to usher her into the next, whatever's next, right? And they had an upfront, not a voyeuristic, bizarre kind of, gawking sort of view, but
they weren't hiding it away.
Exactly. Yeah. It was right there. Yeah.
So that's becoming increasingly, and I mean, I don't know if this is common experience, but 2 years ago when I turned 50, I don't know, man, that birthday hit me.
Yeah.
Like, I think about, this is morbid, I think about death every single day.
Yeah.
I read the obituaries in the Star Tribune every single day. I look through all the obituaries. I look at every picture.
Yeah.
And I just think it's,
The Stoics would do that. They would reflect on death all the time.
It's just in such an important part of human existence is mortality, and we, I think, don't really deal with it. And when you hunt, man, I mean, last weekend, one pheasant I shot in the wing.
Yeah.
It was fully alive. All that was wrong with it was it had a broken wing when my dog brought it to me. And I killed that pheasant I wrung its neck in my hands.
Yeah.
And that's, and then, I came home and we butchered it, and we'll eat it, and that's.
Yeah. It reminds me, but if you have a question, just raise your hand there. Okay, Keith has got one. This is my friend Keith.
How did we get to 100 years ago, death was part of, 50 years ago, years ago, somebody would die in our family, you were there.
Yeah.
That's right.
It wasn't so sterile, hidden away. How do you think we got from there to here? Why is it so,
Yeah.
separated and put away and not talked about?
Yeah, I'm going to repeat the question for those on the line, but yeah, Keith was asking, that 100 years ago and even beyond, we would, a little more tribal, communal, and we would have death. It wasn't hidden away, it wasn't sterilized, wasn't in a room somewhere else and privatized, if you will. So Keith's question was, how did that happen, or what was the process that we know of that led to that?
Well, I think a big part of it is just the extraordinary advancements in medicine, in medical technology. I mean, it's just been, there's been nothing like it in the whole history of bipedal hominids. I mean, you think about it, you're right, that we've had more change in the last 50 or 70 years than our species had for millennia. And along with the good, there's also been, stuff that's been not so good. I'll never forget this. My dad went into the hospital on Wednesday, Ash Wednesday. We went to visit him on Thursday. He was declining. They tried this plasma transfusion thing. We left Thursday night while he was still undergoing this plasma transfusion. At 5 in the morning, my phone rang on that Friday, and the doctor said, we really need you to come in here. He had a really bad night. We've sedated him. And I went in there, and my other brother in town was in there, and then I've got another brother who happens to be a physician in Oregon, and the morning progressed, and we're, on FaceTime with my brother in Oregon, and we're trying to make choices. My dad's in the ICU, and he was struggling to breathe, and they took him from his CPAP, then they put him on the hospital CPAP, and they cranked it all the way up to 100, and then they basically came to us and said, well, the next thing is we intubate him and put him on a respirator because his blood ox levels are dropping even with the CPAP cranked to 100, the industrial strength CPAP. And we're on with my brother in Oregon, the physician, and we ultimately decided not to intubate him.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget that through the curtain, the next family over, they were facing the same thing, and you just wonder how many times a day is this. This is the question: do we intubate or not? And they said, well, "What happens if we intubate him?" Well, he'll live for a couple more weeks at least if you intubate him. Well, we didn't. He died, within an hour. But 2 doctors and a nurse pulled us aside and said to us, independently of one another, my brother and me, and said to us, "Thank you."
Wow. Yeah.
For you made the right decision, and 1 in 10 families makes that decision. 9 out of 10 families says, intubate, even if he lives for another day, it's worth it. Wow. Well, at what cost?
Yeah.
Not only at what cost financially to the hospital and our health insurance system and everything else, but, so I think we have huge ethical dilemmas confronting us in our future about this kind of stuff. So I don't know if that's an answer to the question, but it's funny because I talked to my brother who's a doctor, and it's like, he's like, we don't get to make those decisions. Our job is like, I have to keep people alive as long as their family wants me to keep them alive.
Yeah.
And that's in Oregon, where they actually have, way more progressive laws of like end-of-life laws and stuff like that. So
I read, again, just interrupt me if you have a question, but I read, or I need online a little bit. I read Ernest Becker's book, Denial of Death, years ago, and more or less, he wrote, it won the Pulitzer back in the late 70s, I think, but talks about how we all have this innate fear of dying. Everybody, it's across the board in terms of humanity, are afraid to die, and so we deal with it in any number of ways. And he talks about these 3 forms of psychoses. And one way to deal with death is just to deny that you're going to die and just ignore it and kind of put your head down and go forward. Or rather, there were the two sort of ends of the spectrum were like, one was to be so afraid of dying that you would just sort of hole up, like, was it Howard Hughes right there? And, never go outside, wash your hands constantly, and you would never live life. The other form of psychosis is the other end where people are like, I'm going to die, so I'll push everything to the limit. So they wrestle sharks and they go skydiving and they're just maniac. But a large majority of the rest of us do that third one, which we kind of anesthetize ourselves to, where we put we have these ego projects, our jobs, or whatever we're doing, and we just ignore the fact that, we're hurtling through space on this rock, and, the sun is what the sun, and that we're going to die one day. And but what he argues for is a healthy way to I guess approach death is to just always be aware of it. Yeah. To know that it's going to happen. So whenever I do a funeral, I suggest, I think explicitly, I say the reality of it is that none of us will get out of this place, this earth, alive. The elephant in the room is this person's dead, and we're all going to follow at some point. So to be aware of it, and even daily if you can. I mean, I know it sounds morbid, but to be aware of this, that I'm not immortal. And then 2, Becker, who was a Catholic, he argues to give yourself over to something greater than yourself, which we would probably call God at some point, but in order to kind of have a meaningful life. And so I always think about like becoming more aware of death or alert to death all around us actually helps deeply, I think, enrich your life, because you're like, okay, I'm not going to live forever, but I'm alive now. What am I going to do with that?
Yeah, it's been interesting in COVID how people, it's just brought that right to the forefront for people. My mom is, like I said, she lives real close to us, and she's a widow, obviously, and she's 78, and she decided, she spent the first couple months of the pandemic, like a lot of people her age, holed up, and finally she said, look, I'm going to die. I'm 78. I'm not going to live forever, and I don't want to spend, let's say I've got 5 years left. I don't want to spend 20% of it in my house, never seeing my grandkids. So I'm willing to take certain risks.
Right.
And so she expanded her bubble a little bit. She's got other friends who have not seen their grandkids for a year. Yeah. And she's got other friends who never wear masks and think the whole thing is a hoax. Yeah. So it is funny navigating these, because the pandemic has just really brought that to the forefront. And then, my mom actually is getting her second vaccine dose this Thursday.
Good for her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, good for her only because my brother logged on and at like 12:01 before the thing crashed, he got her an appointment.
Wow.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's just, yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Sue.
Going to the question, or when you were talking about, animals and taking their lives and that, obviously in the Old Testament it talks a lot about, killing animals to the point of just brutal, but I mean,
Yeah.
biblically, where do you see, God's point of view on, killing animals for food, I guess?
Yeah, no, great question. So Sue asked, I'll repeat it because I was going to ask you a similar question, but biblically you have this extremely vibrant image in the temple, of course, in the tabernacle with sacrificial system and animals, and I imagine what that would have been like in the ancient world to have all that, death and animals dying. And so, what is a biblical, perhaps, how does the Bible sort of handle our interaction with animals and dying and sacrificial stuff and even eating? So I mean, it's clearly in Genesis the story goes that seemingly humans were to be vegetarians, and then of course post-flood things seem to change. So I love, maybe you could just sort of wax a little bit on.
That is a good question. Whether, no, I don't know. Humans weren't vegetarians before the flood because, I mean, the first murder in the Bible was over two brothers, one of whom brought wheat and one of whom brought meat. And it's one of the most really troubling passages in all of Scripture because those two brothers, Cain and Abel, there were no rules. Like, Yahweh had not said, I want sacrifices to be burnt meat offering sacrifices. Yeah. The brothers just brought one was a farmer and one was a shepherd, and they just brought what they had, and it turned out God wanted the meat, not the grain. They totally arbitrary, it seems.
Yeah.
Looking back.
Right.
I mean, it's really, I've talked to rabbis about that passage, and they're like, there's no answer.
Yeah.
That's just a terrible, confusing passage. And then the first thing that Noah did after they disembarked from the ark was, this is crazy when you think about it, one of the animals that he had saved, he kills and burns it as a burnt offering to the Lord. And the text says, and the Lord smelt the burnt offering, and it was good, and the smell pleased the Lord. Which is, again, this whole metaphysical thing that we don't really believe anymore, that like we're down here and God's up there smelling our burnt offerings or whatever. But obviously a more primitive cosmology understanding of God. Some people argue that Jesus was an Essene and therefore maybe a vegetarian. There were these different religio-political parties in the time of Jesus, and we hear about some of them, like Herodians, Pharisees, Sadducees, are mentioned in the New Testament. One that's not mentioned is Essenes, but the Essenes were the people who hid the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I mean, if you had to pick a political party that Jesus was a part of, it was probably the Essenes. And they were kind of a monastic, they were very hardcore, spiritually hardcore kind of people.
We were texting back and forth a couple months ago about whether or not John the Baptist was an Essene.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe, probably. It's all speculation, but if they were part of, they were so hard on the Pharisees and the Sadducees and stuff that they may have been Essenes, right? But and maybe the Essenes were vegetarian, whatever. But the thing is, like in the New Testament times, even, and you know this from the book of Acts when Peter is arguing about whether or not it's okay for newly converted Christians to eat meat that had been sacrificed to pagan gods. And then, Peter's up on a roof one day and has this sheet of meat vision, like a daydream kind of vision, where he sees a sheet of meat and he hears this voice that says, don't call unclean what the Lord has called clean. Basically, you can eat sacrificial meat. So the Jews ate the meat that had been sacrificed. they stopped sacrificing when the temple was destroyed in the year 70, and Jews have been a non-sacrificial religion ever since. Christians were never a sacrificial religion, but very early in the church, they were given the green light to eat sacrificial meat, which meant they were meat eaters. And I don't want to step too far out of my area of expertise here, but I know enough about vegetarianism to know that it's very hard to get the nutrients that you need as a human being without meat. And that's now when we've got way more knowledge and a huge variety of food, and we've got supplements and vitamins and everything else. You think about in the ancient world, it would just be very, very difficult to stay healthy as a human being without the protein and a lot of the minerals and vitamins you get from eating meat. So, it seems like meat eating was a normative part of the early church. There have been vegetarian and vegan movements within the church from the early days, but they've almost always been not so much pacifist movements like let's not kill another animal, but more like let's give up something we really love, like of taking a vow of celibacy or taking a vow of poverty or something like that. Yeah. But there have been, St. Francis type infused movements of everything is sacred and let's not ever bring harm to another living creature. I will say the other thing you learn when you spend a lot of time outdoors hunting is you are reminded of how nature is red in tooth and claw. Yeah. There's an Instagram account I follow called Nature is Metal. Anybody else follow Nature is Metal?
I follow Nature is Scary. Same kind of thing.
Okay, similar. Yeah. I mean, it's every single day there's some video of an animal attacking another animal, and you're reminded of like that's reality in the creation that God blessed. Yeah. That it's a brutal, bloody, chaotic world that, flora and fauna exist in. Yeah.
And we're a part of that. I love what you mentioned.
We're a part of it.
You mentioned in the first gathering.
Yeah.
But you quoted the Native American, was she a priest? I forget.
No, she's Jamie Becker Finn was on my podcast last week, and she is in the Minnesota House of Representatives. She represents Roseville, and she's also
not a priest.
And she's also Anishinaabe.
Okay.
And she grew up on the Leech Lake Reservation. Yeah. And she's also Lutheran. Goes to a Lutheran church in Roseville with her wife and with her husband and 2 kids. And but she said on the podcast, when she deer hunts, when she shoots a deer during deer hunting season in November, she thanks the deer for feeding her family. And then as a legislator, and she's on the Environment and Natural Resources Committee. That's one of her committee assignments. And she's very outspoken, Democrat, gun owner, hunter, very outspoken about hunting rights and gun rights and things like that. For conservation and habitat, she is helping the deer feed the deer, like the deer family be fed. So she considers it like, you feed my family and I feed your family, and we live in this symbiotic relationship, which is, very like traditionally Native American way to understand that.
Yeah, I remember when I saw, actually it was in a theology class in undergrad, but we were shown the clip, and I think it was Last of the Mohicans, in the beginning, it's a deer hunting scene, and the Native American man, I think it was, shoots the deer, but then takes a moment to sort of give thanks to the gods, as it were, but for the life of the deer. And it was like the first time I had ever seen where there was, and again, I didn't have a lot of exposure to hunters that are like this, but where this man gave reverence for the life that was being taken, knowing that life would give him life. And that was beautiful for me to see that there is this sort of like a posture of gratitude for the life that was
Yeah, and it's when you shoot a deer, it's pretty easy, I think, to do that because you shoot 1 deer a year or 2 deer a year maybe, and it's a big mammal with eyelashes, and like truly, that's why it's funny because some people, they have no trouble fishing, but they're like, I could never shoot a deer.
Yeah.
Why? Because the big brown eyes with the eyelashes.
Right.
Like it is harder to shoot an animal with eyelashes than it is to like fillet a walleye. We're anthropomorphizing the animals when we do that, right?
Yeah,
you know what I'm saying?
Sure. Yeah.
But it's harder when I have a day like you saw on the slide where last weekend where I shot, a limit of 3 pheasants a day for every day I was out there.
Yeah.
But I will say that my wife, if I'll, it's funny because you don't drive down a lot of streets in Edina and see like a brace of pheasants hanging from a tree in the front yard, but I always hang my birds if the weather's right as long as possible. The meat helps the meat taste better and everything. But then I'll creator and did you thank the pheasants for giving their life for you? Yeah. I will tell you one funny story though. And this only happened, I guess, because, my kid's doing online school. He's 16, but I often will clean pheasants on Tuesday morning because we have organics composting in Edina because, of course, Edina.
Sure. We have it here, too.
Do you?
Yeah, we do.
Oh,
yeah,
I love it.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're with it. Let's go.
It's super bougie in Edina. It's like organic. Who puts out their green bin and who doesn't? It's very judgmental. But
you condescend all the other ones.
So it's funny because now I used to put all the pheasant guts and the feathers and the carcass and whatever in the garbage, but now I put in the organics.
Sure. Yeah.
Because it's organic.
Yeah.
So this is funny. My son told me this a couple weeks ago. He's like, Dad, I was standing in the living room looking out the front window when the organics composting guy came by, and he dumped our bin into the back of his garbage truck. And then I saw him start laughing, and he took out his phone and took pictures because there's 14 pheasants dumped in the back of his truck. And so that's not funny. Something they see every day, probably.
That's funny. I love it. I've got another question, but anybody else want to, or anything online, Olivia? So I would love to hear, and I know we're speculating, but what do you think about, at the end of time, what God will do, what our relationship will be like with the created world, after the end of time, right? So, and what do you make of the way that might be different than now? Does that make sense? Like, what do you think it'll be like with? Will we be eating animals? When the kingdom comes, how will we be living? Will the lion really lie down with the lamb? And I know those are images, but what do you make of the end of time and kingdom come?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
Well, you probably know because I told you all to read the Nicholas Walterstorff articles about God and time.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah.
From last year?
Yeah.
I don't think God is outside of time.
Okay.
And I don't think that, I guess I don't probably think that time will end.
Okay.
So I don't think there's going to be, it's going to end like that, like time will, I don't even know what, and I've consulted rabbis about that too, and I'm like, do you think God's outside of time? They're like, that's ridiculous. Yeah. Absolutely not. Yeah. God is everlasting, not eternal, in that God isn't extricated from time, sitting outside of time in some kind of abstract sense, but God is moving through time with us, and the rabbis say like everything in Scripture talks about God moving through time. Yeah. So when the Bible says, a day is as 1,000 years, as 1,000 years as to a day to the Lord, it's not saying that God's extricated from time. It's just saying God's experience of time, God takes the long view. Yeah. Like God's experience of time is different. God has a perspective that we don't have. Yeah. But I still think God's embedded in time. So I just don't know what it would even mean for there to be an end of time. Of course, Jesus has these images of like they're images that we can understand, like living in a mansion.
Sure. Yeah.
And everybody has their own room.
Right.
But Jesus also has these answers that, like, those of us who love our spouses find very troubling.
Right.
That there's like, oh, there's no marriage. He's like, almost looks down his nose at that question. Like, what a ridiculous question. That's not what it's like at all. Which I guess only serves to make me think, as a theologian, to speculate on that is like really troublesome, because even Jesus is like, you have no idea what it, you know, it's not, these things, these relationships around which you orient your life, like your marriage, for instance, or your relationship to your children, those are irrelevant in when you're in God's kingdom. And I think the similar thing would go for, like, well, what are we going to eat up there?
Right.
You know?
Chipotle, of course.
Up there. I mean, you and your Chipotle thing, it's a bit of an obsession. Wow. Might have to have an intervention or something. Do you go through all of Lent and no Chipotle for Lent?
No, I've never done that, but now maybe I should. Maybe this is God speaking to me.
You think? He couldn't do it?
I have it several times a week. Okay, real quick diversion, because
it's so salty, bro.
Dude,
it's
that's okay.
so salty.
I don't put salt in anything else in my food.
I finish a Chipotle and I'm just like, oh my gosh. I just feel like bloated with salt the rest of the day.
For like $10 or less and get like a healthy meal that fills you up, like around Elk River, like nowhere. Like Panera, but I get like 400 calories on a whole meal from Panera. I need more than 400 calories. You know? Or it costs me $13 and $15. So Chipotle, and they're doing some great work with sustainable agriculture and ethical farming that I like to support if I can, and it's super delicious. Anyhow, go ahead, proceed.
It's super salty, I know that. It's super salty. My kid knew I was coming up here today, and he's like, Dad, you know there's a Cane's in Maple Grove.
Oh yeah, he
on
loves
your way
the
home.
Cane's. Yeah.
My kids are crazy about Cane's. I'm like, it's chicken fingers, you guys. It's not. No, you don't understand. They go online and like watch YouTube videos on how to recreate the Cane's sauce. They're like mixing up Cane's whenever, you know, I'll be like, hey, we're having pheasant for dinner. And they're like, we're making some Cane's sauce to put on your pheasant for dinner or something like that. You people.
How did we get there? What were we talking about? Kingdom come. Anyhow, we'll be eating Chipotle. Yeah, I hear you. I hear you.
I don't know. I don't know. I'm. It's funny. I'm like.
And my question
is, as I become older, I'm less confident in theological convictions and saying stuff. It's funny. I already told you this in like a class podcast thing that I did for the class, but there were these two great. The greatest German theologian of the 20th century was a guy named Karl Barth. And Karl Barth was, one of the things he did that he's very famous for is he authored this thing called the Barmen Declaration, in which it was like a challenge to the national church in Germany, the National Lutheran Church, to divorce itself from the Nazi Party. And he was unsuccessful at that, but they made quite a stand. And obviously, like another Lutheran theologian, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, was greatly influenced and stuff like that. In the generation following Karl Barth, there were really two great German theologians. One was named Wolfhart Pannenberg, who died a couple years ago, and the other one is named Jürgen Moltmann, who's 94 years old, and that's the theologian I've assigned Ryan and his classmates to read.
It's called God in Creation.
God in Creation.
Yeah, check it. It's good.
One of his books, yeah. And it's interesting that somebody once asked Pannenberg, what's the difference between you and Moltmann? And Pannenberg said, when I was 28, I knew everything I was going to say, and I spent the rest of my career saying it.
Yeah.
And Moltmann doesn't even know what his next book is going to be about.
Yeah.
Moltmann's theology has been constantly evolving. Pannenberg did this very traditional German theological thing where he spent his entire career writing a huge 3-volume systematic theology, like door stoppers of books, you know. Yeah. And Moltmann wrote these books like this, like I'm going to write one on creation, I'm going to write one on Jesus, I'm going to write one on the Holy Spirit. You know, that's how he's approached his career. And he's my hero, my theological hero. So I I'm okay with speculative theology,
Yeah.
but I do struggle a little bit with this, like, and everything you hear, even like that, the dad who wrote the book about his son who went to heaven, and it turned out the whole thing was like a complete hoax, and the son sued the dad, and the parents got divorced, and the kid was like, that never happened to me. And after that car wreck, you just think, I think we know very, very, very little about what happens next.
So Moltmann in Ethics of Hope, he talks about this idea of a future hope.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what do you make of stuff like that? I mean, certainly he's the nuts and bolts of it.
You're right. He's very, very hopeful, and he thinks, I guess, to boil down what he would say is what we find in Jesus, in the advent of Jesus, in the coming of a Messiah, is that ultimately what God has for us is good news. Yeah. And so while we don't know the specifics of it, what we do know for certain is that it's hopeful. Like what awaits us is good, because what Jesus brought, and what Paul refers to it as a foretaste, and also as like a down payment. Yeah. Almost like when you put up your earnest money for your house, when you're buying your house, before you get the mortgage and everything else, you're like, here's my 10 grand, save that house for me.
Yeah.
That's one of the ways Paul refers to what Jesus did. It's a down payment. It's God's down payment on what's coming. So at least we can know that in the good news that Jesus brought in his 33 years of life, in his 3 years of ministry, in his week of passion, is a down payment on something awesome that is in Moltmann's word, it's like an eschatological horizon that's approaching us. Like a tidal wave that's going to wash over us at some point.
Yeah, good. That reminds me, and then Sue, in Brian Stevenson's book, for those of you reading Just Mercy along with us, he talks about in chapter 12, I think, the importance of hope, and how those prisoners who've been, the ones who were on death row, and the one woman who got released, I think her name was Marcia Colby, if I'm connecting the right stories. Okay, Katie's my editor, or my researcher, but anyway, this idea of hope. Hope is really, and in Eastern Europe during the Soviet regime, how important hope was for people. So I love that. Yeah, Sue.
So along the lines, I know you don't like to speculate on, what's going to happen. We're all together in Christ, but and Ryan, you and I have talked about this, but do you see animals and nature and beauty all part of, the long-term eternal life?
I mean, my wife,
or the resurrection,
My wife, who's teaching yoga right now, so she's not watching this. If I were to say something like, "There's no dogs in heaven," she would, the locks would be changed by the time I got back to Edina. When I say stuff like that, she gets really, really mad. If we're going to go on, like what the New Testament says, there are a lot of implications of that the creation, the new Jerusalem will be built on the foundations of the current creation. That it's not like this whole thing is wiped out and God starts something new, but that somehow this creation will be transformed into the new creation. And one of the ways that Jesus post-resurrection appearances were, in some ways, he was new because he could walk through walls, and they
didn't recognize him.
Cleopas and his friend on the walk to Emmaus didn't recognize him at first, but then they did recognize him when he broke the bread, but when he appears in the upper room, they recognize him. Not only do they recognize him, but he's actually got they can see the scars from the crucifixion. Or when he's cooking fish on the beach, he's not a ghost. He's like actually cooking fish on the beach. He's doing something he's doing something material.
Embodied.
So theologians have always said that somehow Jesus, again, as Jesus' resurrection body is kind of a foretaste or a down payment on the resurrection for all of us, that somehow his material physical form was transformed into whatever that resurrection body was. It wasn't just like his old body died and his spirit, like God formed a new body around his soul or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's funny in the scholastic period, which was like the theological period of Thomas Aquinas, like in the maybe 13th century or whatever. This is when they, the funny joke of like, they argued how many angels could dance on the head of a pin, and they actually did argue stuff like that. One of the things they argued was who gets the new body in the case of cannibalism. Like, they argued that. So if a human being eats another human being and incorporates that human being into their body, then you come like the last trumpet sounds and everyone's, the graves give up their dead and the sea gives up its dead, and all of a sudden every human being that's like, are those people fighting for that?
Good question.
Fighting for that flesh because somebody ate the other person.
Yeah.
So I mean, this was the kind of thing. This is how seriously they took the resurrection, taking a form of our. Now we'd be like, oh, it's just. God just needs one little DNA spiral to clone us into whatever. I mean, you get into a little bit of science fiction territory there.
Yeah. I heard him say that all dogs do go to heaven. Which
Tell my wife I said that.
Yeah. But Christopher Southgate he's a theologian, and he writes a little bit about this, and it was a question I had in terms of how to deal with the fact that nature is red in tooth and claw. And he writes about the problem of evil for him in the created world is that, and he's an evolutionary theist, so Christopher Southgate argues that this is that God uses evolution to create the world. If that's true, then you have to reconcile this idea that God seems to, as you mentioned, bless this process. It's very, very, it's full of violence and predation and all these kinds of things. And so he does argue for an actual, and it's been a while since I've read the book, but for such a hope as that, and even animals whose lives were cut short and that kind of thing. So I'm with you, Sue. I think they do.
There's a lot of verses in the Bible that, it talks about, man at feast, and then we're all going to, return to the dust, and we're
Yeah.
Ryan, I lost 2 dogs.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
4-year-old black lab.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
We rescued another one later this fall, a brother and sister, and the female died of
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, and I was telling the Ruprechts, before I had a dog, this is why having a dog was actually a very sort of a spiritual awakening.
Wait, you have a dog?
Yeah. His name was, and I named him Augustine because I was reading St. Augustine's Confessions as a part of Tony's class, and I loved the book. It was
It's a great book.
It was so good. And in my sort of evangelical upbringing, Augustine catches a lot of flack. Some of it's fine, but I think he's often misunderstood. Anyway, so before I got a dog, I was disconnected from even the animal kingdom, really, in terms of, I had a fish, and I used to catch snakes, but now that I have this dog, I'm definitely think all dogs go to heaven, right? But it sort of helped me become more sensitive to all of creatures in large and small ways, and I just love him, and it's like, he's right. Tony mentioned in the first gathering how cliche it is to say that we love dogs, but I don't know, there is something about that relationship. And you told me recently about Andrew Root wrote a book, and I showed it to my wife, but about, what's it called? The Black Lab?
Grace of Dogs.
Yeah, The Grace of Dogs. And there's something about, I don't know, taking care of animals and that relationship between humans and animals and how they see us and seeing them. And it's quite beautiful.
There is one theory that dogs are central to the evolution of human beings, and the reason that Homo sapiens sapiens, which is what we are, even exist is in large part because of dogs. And the theory, in a nutshell, is that in very early primitive tribal societies, that wolves started to come around human encampments, and the humans fed the wolves, and over time, over thousands of years, the wolves became more and more incorporated and more tame, to the point that the humans were almost breeding the wolves. And in exchange for the food, the wolves protected the human beings. Yeah. And because of the protection of the domesticated wolves, the Homo sapiens sapiens were able to sleep
Yeah.
for 4, 5, 6, 7 hours at a stretch. And because of that extended sleep, human brains developed in a way that Neanderthal brains didn't. And this was, this is the big fork in the road where we ended up where we are and the Neanderthals died out. And one of the theories is that we ended up where we are because dogs allowed us to develop bigger brains, which led to tools and things like this. And that's why Homo sapiens defeated Neanderthals.
Yeah.
So thank God for dogs.
There you go. Yeah, it's Andrew Root's book, The Grace of Dogs. I haven't read it yet, but Tony was mentioning it to me, and there's something about that to me. So.
Well, especially after rescuing a dog that just cannot get close enough to you because
Yeah.
it goes to show how much they want that human.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Sue was just mentioning how much dogs love human interaction. I was joking, but I said my dog is an Enneagram 7. Gus, because he kind of is. But my wife's like, all dogs love humans. They're all 7.
It's funny. My wife says her dog's an Enneagram 7 too.
Yeah. Your wife and I have a lot in common. Dude, thanks for hanging out with us, man. I
It's
appreciate
been
it.
super fun.
I want to honor your time and everyone else's time, but yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so thanks for being with us and thanks for hanging out. Wendy?
What's the name of your podcast? Do you have a website?
The Reverend Hunter, also the name of my website, also the name of my Instagram account. Yeah, the Reverend Hunter.
Go down the rabbit hole. So
The
our
Reverend
friend
Hunter.
Court Van Epps, if you guys know Court, he's a part of our house church. I ran into them at Aldi last night doing some Super Bowl snack shopping, and I was telling him, I think he maybe brought you up, but so Court, he goes, oh, I think I know him. I go, really? He goes, yeah, I think I heard his podcast. I go, really? He goes, yeah, he's the guy who will go and he'll exchange, he'll preach for a Sunday, and then they'll let him hunt on their land. I'm like, I'd never heard of that. I'm like, are you sure it's the right guy? And sure enough,
Yeah.
he told that story this morning. But so Court has been following Tony for like a long time.
Oh, that's cool.
Like, that's so great, man. So I don't know if he met you or came and said hi, but well, thanks for hanging out, you guys. If you want to hang out, I'm sure he'll be here for another minute or two. But otherwise, thanks again, man. Appreciate you. Thanks for everyone joining us online.